Welcome to Manifested Publishers.
Hello, how are you? I hope you are faring on well. Welcome to our today's history and government lesson. I'm glad that you have been able to find time to join me in our today's lesson. Before we dwell on what we are going to learn today, let us remind ourselves what we learned in our previous lesson. In our previous lesson, we studied the company rule in Kenya. And we learned that in Kenya, or in the British East African Protectorate, it was administered by the Imperial British East African Company, which was given a charter or rights to govern or to exercise authority over the Kenyan territory, and it had various aims and objectives, one of which was to abolish slave trade. It was also to make sure that it establishes trade links and trading activities, and also it was to administer the territory on behalf of the British government, among other objectives. And also we were able to learn on the achievements and the challenges that were facing the Imperial British East African Company in administration of the Kenyan territory. And we mentioned towards the end that the Imperial British East African Company was very essential in establishing foundations upon which now the British government came to form or to establish control over the Kenyan territory. So in our today's lesson, we are going to study about the methods used by the British to occupy Kenya. The methods that were used by the British to occupy Kenya or during the colonial rule. So what methods did they use to occupy Kenya? So as I've mentioned, the Imperial British East African Company was unable, or it was overwhelmed by the administration of the colony, because it had become very expensive on their part, and that made the British government to send now direct representatives or to take over the administration or the rule of the Kenyan territory. So they had to come and occupy and ensure that the area is occupied. And they had to get these colonies or to occupy the Kenyan colony in different ways. And that is what we are going to be learning about in our today's lesson. So the first way in which they occupied the territory or Kenya was through signing of treaties. Signing of treaties. A treaty is an agreement. A treaty is an agreement. So the British representatives had to come and sign agreements with African leaders. As you have learned in your previous topics, in Form 1, the African societies, the Kenyan societies, had their own ways or structures of governance. They had rulers. They had an administrative system. Some had centralized systems, others had decentralized system. There are those communities that had council of elders, others had paramount chiefs, or they had kings that administered the kingdoms. So what the British did, they would come and make agreements with the African leaders. An example is the Maasai Agreement that was made in 1904 and 1911. An example is the Maasai Agreement that was made in 1904. We are going to be discussing more of this as we go forward at 1911. So they made agreements with the African leaders to allow them to take occupation of certain portions of land. To the Africans, these agreements had no meaning because they were only trying to allow the British for a time. But now for the British, it was a legitimate commitment on the African leaders that they had allowed the British to come and take right, or to take authority over that land. But to the Africans, they thought it was just a way of protection from neighbors or from enemies. So to the Africans, they were just being protected by the British. But now, on paper, on what the terms that were made in these agreements, the Africans were signing away their land. So that was the first way in which they got the territory, or the first method they used to occupy the Kenyan territory. The other one that was the most common was use of military force. These involved sending expeditions. Sending of expeditions against rebellious communities. So when the communities realized that the British were taking away their land, they were occupying their kingdoms, most of the communities decided to rebel or to revolt against the British. So these forced the British to resort to armed or to a forceful occupation of that land. That was military. This was the most common way in which they occupied the Kenyan territory. Some of the communities that were able to resist or fight against the invasion of the British are the Nandi. We had the Bukusu, we had the Luo, and also a section of the Agikuyu were able to rise up in resistance against the British. So that is the second way in which they were able to get territories in Kenya. Number three, they used construction of administrative posts. So what the British government did, they could construct or build forts or posts where they could act as their headquarters, where they could make decisions. And these posts were used to plan, and they were used to exert control over the people. So the British made several bases where they could operate from. These were also residence for the official. So the officials lived in these posts, and then it was also a base of operation base. That is, these posts that were created or that were built or that were also known as the forts. We discussed them in our previous, we mentioned them in our previous lesson. So these became places where they could organize or they could continue to rule over the people. Number 4 was they employed the tactic of collaboration. Collaboration. This was done with powerful leaders. Powerful leaders. So they approached powerful leaders and offered them protection against their enemies. So they could use these African leaders to conquer their neighbors. An example of such a collaboration was done with Lenana of the Maasai. And another one is the Wanga, right? The Wanga Nabongo Mumia of the Wanga people. So they collaborated with these African leaders to be able to conquer other communities. So they used one African community to fight against another African community. So through these leaders, the British were able to exert on them even taxes and protection. They offered protection to the African leaders, and the leaders in turn gave their people or ordered their people to cooperate or work together with the British. And then the second last method that was used, they used missionaries. Use of missionaries. Missionaries. Remember, these had come even way before there was need for colonization. So the missionaries were used to soften the hearts of the African leaders. The missionaries encouraged the African people to cooperate. They encouraged cooperation. So the African people were encouraged by the missionaries to cooperate and work together with the British government or with the British officials. So they persuaded the leaders not to revolt against the British officials. And then lastly, the last method that was used by the British to occupy the land was that of treachery or trickery. They could trick the African leaders. They could trick the African leaders to give away their land. They could trick the African leaders to give away their land in exchange of gifts and protection. So they would come to a leader and tell them, we are going to offer you protection. For example, Lenana, we are going to offer you protection against the Agikuyu. So Lenana was the leader of the Maasai, and they had traditional rivalry with the Agikuyu. So they tricked Lenana into accepting to work together or collaborate with the British in the pretext that he's being offered protection. But what in essence he was doing was signing away his territory to the British. So the British tricked the African leaders into giving out their land. So the African people were tricked into giving out or signing out their land in the pretext of being offered protection. So those are the methods that the British used to occupy Kenya. Number 1, they signed treaties with the African leaders. Number 2, they used military force, or in other words, military conquest. Number 3, they constructed administrative posts that acted as the residences for the British officials, and also it was a base of operation. It was a base of operation. Pardon my my spelling there. Operation. It was a base of operation, and also they collaborated with the African leaders, and then they used missionaries to persuade Africans to cooperate with the British, and then lastly they used treachery as a method of acquiring territory. So as we end our lesson, as we come to the end of our lesson, are you able to attempt this question? So a revision question. A revision question. The question is, discuss the various ways used by the British to occupy discuss the various ways used by the British to occupy the Kenyan territory. And that now brings us or marks the end of our history and government lesson. I've been your teacher, Conan Gakure. Until the next time we shall meet in this same platform. Bye-bye.